If you're trying to figure out how to invest in SpaceX using Merrill Edge, there's an important reality you need to understand right from the start, and it will shape everything you do from here. SpaceX is not a public company. That means you cannot simply log into Merrill Edge, search for SpaceX, and press buy like you would with Apple, Tesla, or Amazon. Even though SpaceX is one of the most valuable private companies in the world, it is still privately held, which places it outside the normal stock market system. SpaceX, officially known as SpaceX, is owned primarily by its founders, employees, and private investors. Its shares do not trade on the New York Stock Exchange or Nasdaq. That's the first and most important barrier you have to understand. And Merrill Edge, which is the brokerage platform owned by Bank of America, is designed primarily for public market investing. So what that means is that Merrill Edge can help you invest in stocks, ETFs, bonds, mutual funds, and other publicly traded securities, but it cannot directly give you access to private equity deals in companies like SpaceX. So the real question becomes not, how do I buy SpaceX on Merrill Edge, but rather, how can I get exposure to SpaceX using the tools available through Merrill Edge or through related investing strategies? And that's exactly what we're going to break down step by step in a realistic, practical way. First, you need to set up the foundation, which is your Merrill Edge account. If you don't already have one, the process starts by opening a brokerage account through Merrill Edge. This usually involves providing identification details, linking your bank account, and funding your account. Once your account is active, you gain access to the public markets. This is where most people stop and realize the limitation. SpaceX is not listed, so there is no direct ticker symbol to search for. At this point, many beginners assume they've hit a dead end, but experienced investors know that when a company is private, you look for indirect exposure. That means instead of trying to buy SpaceX directly, you look for companies that benefit from SpaceX's growth, suppliers that work with SpaceX, or investment vehicles that hold private shares of companies like SpaceX. One of the most common indirect methods is investing in aerospace and defense companies that operate in similar ecosystems. These might include companies involved in rocket manufacturing, satellite technology, or government space contracts. While this does not give you ownership in SpaceX itself, it allows your portfolio to benefit from the same industry growth that SpaceX is driving. Through Merrill Edge, you can easily buy shares of these public companies or ETFs that track the aerospace sector. Another path some investors explore is private market exposure through specialized funds or platforms that sometimes include pre-IPO companies. These are not directly available inside Merrill Edge itself, but you can still fund external investments using money from your linked bank account. However, this is where things become more complex, because access to private shares of companies like SpaceX is typically limited to accredited investors or institutional buyers. Even when available, it often comes with high minimum investments and long lock-up periods. There are also secondary marketplaces, where private shares are sometimes traded between early employees and investors. These platforms occasionally list stakes in companies like SpaceX, but again, these are not something you directly execute through Merrill Edge. Instead, Merrill Edge simply becomes your funding hub, while the actual investment happens elsewhere. This is an important distinction because many people misunderstand brokerage platforms as universal investment gateways, when in reality they are only designed for regulated public securities. Now let's go deeper into a more strategic mindset. If your goal is to benefit from the growth of SpaceX, you need to think like a portfolio strategist rather than a direct buyer. SpaceX is heavily involved in satellite deployment, reusable rocket technology, government contracts, and global internet infrastructure through its Starlink division. So the real opportunity is in identifying the broader value chain around that ecosystem. For example, companies involved in semiconductor manufacturing, satellite communications infrastructure, aerospace components, and defense systems often move in correlation with advancements in private space companies. Through Merrill Edge, you can build a portfolio that mirrors these trends. You're essentially creating a SpaceX adjacent investment strategy, even though you cannot own SpaceX itself. Another angle worth understanding is that many venture capital firms and private equity funds have exposure to SpaceX. These funds are usually not accessible to retail investors, but occasionally certain publicly traded investment trusts or diversified innovation funds may hold late-stage private companies. In rare cases, some ETFs or thematic funds may have indirect exposure through private market allocations or related holdings. The key is to always read the fund composition carefully before assuming SpaceX exposure exists. Now, if you still want a step-by-step mental framework for how someone using Merrill Edge would approach this, it would look like this in practice. First, you open and fund your Merrill Edge account, ensuring it is fully activated and ready for trading. Second, you define your goal clearly, which in this case is exposure to the space and satellite economy rather than direct ownership of SpaceX. Third, you research publicly traded aerospace, defense, and satellite companies that align with SpaceX's ecosystem. Fourth, you allocate your investments across those companies, or ETFs, in a diversified way, rather than betting on a single stock. Fifth, you continuously monitor industry developments, because the aerospace sector evolves quickly, with new launches, contracts, and technological breakthroughs. It's also important to understand timing. SpaceX is still private because it does not need public markets for funding. It raises capital through private investors and government contracts, which means there is no confirmed timeline for an IPO. While there is always speculation that it may eventually go public, there is no guarantee, and planning your investment strategy around a possible future IPO is highly speculative. A more realistic approach is to treat SpaceX as a long-term innovation driver that influences multiple public markets, rather than as a stock you are waiting to buy. This mindset shift is what separates casual investors from strategic ones. Another thing to keep in mind is risk management. The aerospace sector is highly volatile and heavily influenced by government budgets, technological success rates, and global competition. So even though the space industry is exciting, it should still be treated as a portion of a diversified portfolio, not the entire strategy. When you step back and look at the bigger picture, Merrill Edge becomes your access point to traditional financial markets, while SpaceX remains part of the private innovation layer of the economy. The bridge between the two is indirect exposure, sector investing, and private market awareness. So if you came into this thinking there would be a simple button that says buy SpaceX stock on Merrill Edge, the truth is that such a button does not exist. But what does exist is a much more powerful approach: understanding the ecosystem around SpaceX and positioning yourself in the public companies and funds that benefit from its continued expansion. In the end, investing is not always about buying the exact company you admire. Sometimes it's about identifying the wave that company is creating and positioning yourself where that wave spreads through the rest of the market. And in the case of SpaceX, that wave extends into aerospace engineering, satellite communications, defense technology, and even global internet infrastructure. If you approach it this way, your Merrill Edge account becomes more than just a trading platform. It becomes a gateway into entire industries shaped by companies like SpaceX, even if the company itself remains out of direct reach for now.